Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Race and the Suburbs in American Film. Edited by Merrill Schleier. Narrated by Amir Abdullah and Patryce Williams. Introduction. Race and the Suburbs in American Film. Merrill Schleier. Lost Boundaries. Worker, 1949. Was released 2 years after the completion of the first Levittown suburb in Long Island, New York, which was a harbinger of the massive post-war expansion of such dwellings. Based on a true story that occurred in the 1920s, the film largely takes place in a small white New England town and concerns Dr. Scott Carter, Mel Ferrer, an African-American physician and his family who pass for white, but whose identities are unearthed when he tries to enlist as an officer during World War II and is rejected. The subsequent discovery by the townspeople and Dr. Carter's own children of his long-held secret prompts everyone's soul-searching before the venerable physician is embraced anew by his all-white patients, culminating in a sanctifying church service. The colonial town, with its lily-white homes and public buildings, may serve as a synecdoche for the emerging suburbs' little white houses, environs, and inhabitants. Yet the community's embrace of Dr. Carter is not consonant with the reactions of whites to African Americans' efforts to integrate the country's newly built post-war suburbs. Hence the film's producer, Louis de Rochemont, believed that Lost Boundaries could have an ameliorative effect on current race relations and their concomitant spatial divisions, that it might help white Americans turn away from outmoded, separate but equal legislation and change the country's racial dynamics, a hope that proved elusive. But the fact that de Rochemont envisioned the film for white audiences served only to reinforce prevailing racial hierarchies. Karen Baldry argues further that the producer's use of white actors to play African-American characters underscored the film's valorization of whiteness and the replication of the country's racial caste system. By focusing the narrative on a singular and exceptional African-American family at a time when race riots over housing were roiling the nation, Lost Boundaries served as only a liberal plea for limited integration. Its story of token inclusion, through a conformist philosophy of racial assimilation, ostensibly told from the point of view of an African-American family, foreshadows the manner in which most subsequent suburb films reproduced whiteness. This anthology's chronological parameters begin during the post-war era, when housing shortages altered the physical landscape of the United States, which resulted in a suburban explosion, according to historian David M.P. Freund, and when a massive government-sponsored re-segregation of the nation was underway between 1950 and 1970, the population of the suburbs doubled to nearly 74 million, and by 2018, it rose to 175 million people. Even though suburbs developed in America in the early 19th century as a way for whites to retire to more salubrious, semi-rural locations, in part to avoid what they deemed riffraff in the increasingly more crowded and diverse urban centers, the far-reaching post-World War II exodus from cities to suburbs irrevocably changed the nation's geography and racial demography. The emergence of what has variously been referred to as suburb or suburban films, which continue up to the present, begins soon after the war, when these material changes coincided with political events. The suburban post-war housing boom, with its concomitant racial restrictions, and the civil rights movement's targeted focus on the integration of housing and social space. The book ends in the present, when suburbs have increased exponentially with more diverse architectural and spatial typologies and inhabitants, but when segregation, discriminatory practices, and racialized income inequality still haunt their parameters. Race and the Suburbs in American Film focuses on narrative films, since they differ from television and other media in their initial representations of the suburbs. Post-war television shows were poised to satisfy sponsors and advertisers, often presenting, until not far in the past, a utopian affirmative image of white nuclear families in such locales, e.g., Leave It to Beaver, Father Knows Best, Ozzie and Harriet, while suburb films were concerned more frequently with subject matter rife with conflict or with neighborhoods under siege, fabricated to garner wider audience members. This book commences with the premise that Hollywood cinematic iterations have not encompassed the suburb's complexities, neither its varied typologies, nor its heterogeneous inhabitants, nor do they address America's diverse audiences at the level of inclusion, production, or reception. Up until recently, many of those considered white, middle class, and heterosexual enjoyed the privilege of imagining themselves in such cinematic tales of suburban nostalgia. But despite the ability of blacks, Latinx, Asian Americans, and other minorities to project themselves into these fictional settings, they possessed neither the luxury of inhabiting such locations nor of entering or leaving them at will. Several studies concerning the suburban film, television, and fiction in the last 2 decades precede this anthology, but the majority do not concentrate on race in American cinema exclusively. Perhaps the first to explore racialized representations of the suburbs in American literature was Catherine Yurka, focusing predominantly on the construction of whiteness. She claims that fictional portrayals of the suburbs frequently portray its privileged, dysfunctional middle-class white denizens as placeless victims at a time when African Americans were suffering real discrimination in matters of housing. Amy Marie Kenyon's book, Dreaming Suburbia, Detroit and the Production of Post-War Space and Culture, 2004, followed. It explored spatial themes in suburban film and fiction, including the tensions produced by the racialized suburbs and their counterpart, the cities. Both Robert Buca's Suburbia Nation, Reading Suburban Landscape in 20th Century American Fiction and Film, 2004, and David R. Kuhn's Look Closer, Suburban Narratives and American Values in Film and Television, 2014, address utopian and dystopian suburban variants in cinema and the idea of the suburbs, with single chapters on race. Timotheus Vermeulen's Scenes from the Suburbs, 2014, acknowledges rightly the need for an analysis of race and ethnicity in more theoretical and aesthetic terms, and includes a short treatment of the television show Desperate Housewives. Recently, Amy Lynn Corbin's Cinematic Geographies and Spectatorship in America, 2015, asserts in an excellent chapter devoted solely to suburb films that the display of otherness in the suburbs is often accomplished through displacement. For example, themes of teen rebellion or alien invasion may serve as metaphors for racial and cultural difference. In the last 5 years, several other books that treat film and the suburbs in an international context have appeared but have not concerned themselves with race as their primary focus. Suburb films, from cycle to genre. American suburb films emerged in Hollywood in the late 1940s and lasted for about 10 years during a time of intense debate concerning the viability of white middle-class suburban living and a vexed period of racial apartheid, when overt and covert racial violence was employed to protect white suburban domestic space from blacks, Asian Americans, Latinx, and those deemed other. These include such post-World War II examples as Pitfall, De Toth, 1948, Desperate Hours, Weiler, 1955, The Man in the Gray Flannel Suit, Johnson, 1956, Rebel Without a Cause, Ray, 1956, and Crime of Passion, Oswald, 1956. Suburb films rely on the suburban environs, place, which may include the negotiation of its domestic interiors, space, as a motivating force in the cinematic plot in significant ways, whether thematically, through character development, or spatial logic. Defying cinema's traditional categories and periodizations, suburb films include, but are not limited to, melodramas, film noirs, social problem films, comedies, science fiction, and horror films. These diverse examples of suburb films are part of a cinematic cycle, according to Amanda Klein's definition, sharing similar images, characters, settings, plots, or themes. According to Klein, cycles are short-lived and topical, and may emerge from a single film, continuing beyond their original source only if they are critically successful and garner a large audience, ever attendant to the latter's desires, while pointing to film's commercial or use value. Preceding genres, film cycles are concerned especially with the way cultural discourses by filmmakers, audiences, reviewers, and current events interact with cinematic texts. Since cycles are linked to current events or material conditions, it is necessary to historicize them in their cultural, political, economic, and material milieus. Suburb films from the late 1940s until the late 1950s accord with Klein's assertion that cycles emerge in response to contemporary discussions taking place in the mass media. In this case, the widely debated nature of suburban life after World War II. Contemporary boosters, politicians, and real estate interests promoted the suburbs as utopian, wholesome, and exclusive, while social critics such as David Reisman, William H. White, and Betty Friedan decried variously their putative soul-crushing conformism and commodity fetishism for middle-class white people, while remaining conspicuously silent on the suburbs' effects upon racialized others. Most suburb cycle films begin by establishing the insufficiencies of white middle-class suburban life, but even at their most disparaging and destabilizing, these seemingly dystopian tales opt for suburban restoration or rehabilitation. For example, No Down Payment, Writ, 1957, explores a Japanese-American family's effort to move into the all-white Sunrise Hills in Southern California's Orange County, far from Los Angeles's dense urban population and diverse inhabitants. Despite the cinematic suburbs' upbeat moniker, wholesome architectural facades, and seemingly friendly nuclear families, dysfunctional men and their accommodating wives, an alcoholic philanderer, a sadistic former sergeant turned rapist, and an ineffectual organization man occupy the cloistered enclave. At the film's denouement, the rapist is killed, the husbands regain their professional standing, and the church-going Japanese-American family is allowed to move in by ellipsis, thus restoring the promise of the suburb. Suburb films have surprisingly continued after the cycle's initial decade and up to the present, with similar syntactical and semantic elements, thus rendering them more akin to Rick Altman's theorization of genres. But Altman cautions us not to assume that all genres operate in the same manner or in universal terms. Some begin slowly, assuming familiar patterns, while others go through various paradigms, but always in dialogue with the flow of time. Generic suburb films include but are not limited to Bachelor in Paradise, Arnold, 1961, The Stepford Wives, Forbes, 1975, Ordinary People, Redford, 1980, Pleasantville, Ross, 1998, American Beauty, Mendez, 1999. Continuing into the 21st century with Donnie Darko, Kelly, 2001, Revolutionary Road, Mendez, 2008, and Suburbicon, Clooney, 2016. Many of their syntactical and semantic features, which commenced in previous cycle films, have been identified in several of the aforementioned cinematic suburb studies. Key themes include the appearance of a white, dysfunctional middle-class family unit, often consisting variously of emasculated male homeowners, bored housewives, and rebellious teenagers who seek independence from their surroundings, often in the city, all of whom are subject to the overwhelming character of suburban conformity and the quest for consumer goods occasioned by a belief in the American dream. Even the few mid-century suburb films about the provisional and problematic inclusion of minorities, such as No Down Payment, Writ, 1957, and Take a Giant Step, Leacock, 1959, or Minority Assimilation, Transgression, and Rebellion in the later Better Luck Tomorrow, Lynn, 2002, and Emrika, Dibus, 2009, explore newcomers' negotiations of predominantly white spaces and their challenging attempts at assimilation. These thematic features are accompanied by such semantic elements as placelessness and entrapment, which are prompted in part by the homogeneity and seeming pervasiveness of the built environment. Placelessness is often represented by downward tilt shots, or bird's-eye views of nondescript, prefabricated houses as far as the eye can see, engendering a sense of social and existential alienation among its largely white denizens. While I do not seek to interrogate all of the syntactical and semantic elements and narrative conventions of typical suburb films, it is necessary to problematize them in order to excavate their racialized underpinnings. That said, films situated in African American, Asian American, Latinx, and immigrant suburbs have been understudied, excluded from the canon, prompting a reevaluation, if not an expansion, of the suburb film's cyclical and generic parameters, and a reconsideration of what we mean by a suburb film. There is no consensus concerning what constitutes a real suburb, since they have changed so dramatically over time, including edge cities, ethnoburbs, and planned sprawl. Nevertheless, Hollywood has appropriated and focused repeatedly on a particular variant, privately owned, generic-looking homes in planned, decentralized communities where white heteronormative families reside. Yet since the 1970s, the suburb's shifting demographic, geographic, and diverse architectural character calls for a critical analysis of Hollywood's stubborn adherence to outdated suburban stereotypes, constituting a veritable cultural lag. The film industry's selective depictions of demographic and architectural sameness prevail even though working class and racially, ethnically, and architecturally diverse suburbs have existed in Los Angeles, Baltimore, and Washington, D.C. for decades. Becky M. Nicolaitis and Andrew Weiss, in their magisterial Suburb Reader, point to the suburb's multiplicity and the particularized experiences of its varied residents, African Americans, Latinx, Asian American, and working-class suburbanites. Just as the suburbs were engaged in the politics of racial exclusion, in a parallel process, Hollywood has habitually occluded others' points of view from its suburban-inspired boundaries, often reducing them to ancillary characters that occupy the margins of the narratives. Nicolaitis and Weiss claim that these representations remain one legacy of a long history of Imagineering in the mass media in which whites were the only suburbanites who mattered. In addition to interrogating whiteness, this book adapts Nicolaides and Weiss's important query to suburb films. How did the other suburbanites ascribe meaning to their own living spaces? The racialized spatial turn. Suburban typologies, suburban neighborhoods. Race and the Suburbs in American Film's Contributors open up suburb films to spatial theorization, whether through an analysis of location shooting, production design, or characters' habitation, and negotiation of such places and spatial arrangements. Even though films are not passive reflections of material or social reality, they engage in a dialogue with their actual counterparts and inform cinematic adaptations. In this way, this book expands upon my own Skyscraper Cinema, 2009, and Pamela Robertson Wojcik's excellent books, The Apartment Plot, 2010, and The Apartment Complex, 2018, with a focus on the constructed cinematic environment's spatiality as a crucial component of investigation, rather than relying on traditional genre or auteurist analyses. As urban geographer David Delaney argues, space is an enabling technology through which race is produced. For example, it may be the result of such diverse ideologies as colorblindness, race consciousness, integrationist, assimilationist, separatist, and nativist, among others. Delaney encourages us to interrogate the spatial conditions under which one absorbs an assigned racial category, and how one learns to negotiate its spaces. When we take such racialized spaces seriously, he continues, we must also consider such race-making events as displacement, dislocation, and relocation. It is well known that post-World War II suburbs were built on the principle of the exclusion of those deemed non-white, enshrined in racial covenants, redlining, and Federal Housing Administration rules, and further enforced by physical barriers such as walls, cul-de-sacs, dead ends, and green belts. Even freeways were constructed to separate the city from suburban neighborhoods to safeguard whiteness. Yet, most of cinema's suburban cinematic narratives focus instead on the spatial travails of their white inhabitants rather than the white suburbs' more urgent sufferers, while ignoring the heterogeneous suburbs and their diverse inhabitants. For example, the semantics of placelessness seen in many suburban films is not simply an illustration of feelings of spatial alienation experienced by monolithic suburb dwellers, as several scholars claim, but it affects diverse populations and cinematic characters differently. One way to understand the racial underpinnings of placelessness is to problematize the suburbs' uniformly styled houses, peopled by similar, conforming inhabitants, who mirror their generic dwellings, as well as their cinematic representations. We must bear in mind that real estate developers like William Levitt adopted architectural sameness, in part as a purposeful tactic to valorize whiteness in the assimilation of racial and ethnic differences, a ploy copied by Hollywood filmmakers and production designers to signify the suburbs. Architectural historian Diane Harris explores how such unacknowledged whiteness and its connection to property ownership permeated all aspects of the ideological and physical construction of the mid-century suburbs, its standardized classical revival and ranch-style architecture, house plans, and interior design principles, which were then repeatedly reinforced in the media as a form of publicity and propaganda, instructing suburban residents how to perform and assimilate to whiteness in their suburban abodes and surrounding environs. Writing in 1955, housing expert Charles Abrams demonstrates that architectural consistency was supposed to extend to a house's inhabitants. Suburban middle-class denizens were told to be homogeneous, not to mix with the rich or poor, and to use restrictions to keep the wrong people out, because inharmonious racial, national, or income groups led to a decrease in property values. Thus Harris insists that no exploration of the suburbs or its various representations in popular culture, and I argue in Hollywood cinema, are valid without a discussion of race, even when it seems invisible. Filmmaker Jordan Peele explores placelessness in an exclusive white suburban space from the perspective of African American city dwellers in Get Out, 2017, employing the horror genre to underscore his point. An anonymous black man in the film's initial nocturnal scene feels trepidation while traversing a generic suburban neighborhood in Connecticut, indicating that de facto segregation and Jim Crow are still prevalent in the putatively liberal Northeast. Sensing that he is out of his element, the man describes the neighborhood's look-alike dwellings and the confounding spatiality of its cul-de-sacs as a confusing-ass suburb, where Edgewood Way and Edgewood Lane are indecipherable. As architectural historian Barbara Miller Lane explains, the layout of these suburbs, the large picture windowed houses facing one another in circular cul-de-sacs, feature ample front lawns without boundary fencing, which extended to the street, were purposely planned as confounding spaces, in part to keep such unwanted visitors out. Soon the man's anxiety assumes tangible form as a color-coded white vehicle begins to track his movement down the street before a masked ninja emerges and removes him forcibly, recalling the body snatching occasioned by slavery, police violence, and the white suburban resistance that accompanied integration. Augmenting the work of David Delaney, George Lipsitz challenges us further to assess the relationship between the spatial dynamics of racial segregation and racial representation. He argues that racism takes place and that social relations take on their full force and meaning when they are enacted physically in actual places, such as the suburbs, which shape and reproduce the significance of race. He further posits the idea of white and black racialized spatial imaginaries in material spaces and in fictional, artistic, and by implication, cinematic representations. For instance, the white spatial imaginary, of which the suburb serves as an archetype, structures feelings as well as social institutions. It idealizes pure and homogeneous spaces, controlled environments, and predictive patterns of design and behavior. According to Lipsitz, suburbs promote the values of individual escape and private acquisition, e.g., home ownership and commodities, which he refers to as a possessive investment in whiteness, rather than collective action seen in the black spatial imaginary that benefits all, serving as the locus for exchange value and the exclusion of non-normative others. While his paradigm is useful for the analysis of such spaces in cinema, we must also recognize that racialized spatial imaginaries are neither transhistorical nor perpetual and must be interrogated to identify how they operate temporarily and in discrete locations. Most Hollywood-produced suburb films are predicated on such white spatial imaginaries and have until recently been composed of generic neighborhoods that house heteronormative families, which either exclude or jettison people of color and those considered other from their boundaries, both narratively and spatially. Crime of Passion, 1956, for example, tells the story of queer, white, San Franciscan Kathy Ferguson, Barbara Stanwyck, who begins the film as an accomplished journalist, supporting a community of distinct women through her newspaper column, but marries her way to a lowbrow, all-white Los Angeles suburb in the San Fernando Valley, where social conformity and architectural monotony prevail. The now stymied housewife soon covets a majestic Westwood suburban home, like the one owned by Chief Inspector Tony Pope, Raymond Burr, her husband's boss, a way of trading up to attain success, wholly absorbing the values of the American dream and its spatial analog, a better white suburb. A failed extramarital affair with Pope to achieve her quest for upward mobility leads to a criminal act, hence her ineluctable downfall, transferring her from the perceived carceral spaces of the suburbs to the penitentiary.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?